Let's listen to Ben Shapiro. This is the pillar of the intellectual pillar of the right, we're told, right? Isn't he the
cool kid's philosopher?
The cool kid's philosopher. Apparently, it turns out, cool kids, they make stuff up. And where do I have this sheet here? Oh, yeah, they make stuff up. Stuff that even without even having to Google, you're like, wait a second, that's not right. But if you say it in a way that makes it look like you have your deep thought, or like I am one of those people who completely don't recognize that other people have humanity, and so I'm going to say it now. This is going to make it appear that I am actually delivering information that is both profound and intellectually rigorous in its presentation, because why else would I be here? I'm not even someone who can make eye contact with the camera.
Why else would I feel confident enough to speak in the stupid voice if I wasn't saying real things?
When you talk very quickly and you say things that have been pronounced in such a way, with a vocabulary that has been cultivated by some time at an Ivy League school, people tend to accept what you're saying. And they say, with someone with so little amount of charisma, it must be, of course, based on the facts that our people are responding to what are my messages. Here he is, trying to argue, just because the facts compel him to, the superiority of the judeo-christian world, which apparently he's not even aware is a relatively recent, at least, moniker.
Truth is that the vision of modern science, the idea of hypothesis and hypothesis being rejected by evidence, that sort of science, experimental science, is unique to the West. There's a difference between technological progress, which does exist in a vast number of civilizations, and that technological progress is generally linked to the human need to overcome the environment around them. There's a difference between that and the pure idea of exploring science for its own sake, which then has technical applications later. That is something that seems fairly unique to the West, which is why you see thinkers in the West like Isaac Newton, who are trying to figure out general rules of the universe in a way that very few people were doing in other civilizations. That doesn't mean that every other person in every other civilization was incapable of doing this. Obviously, there were strides in science and mathematics, particularly in the Indian world, as in like India, in the Indian world.
All right, pause it. Well, we're just going to stop here for a little bit. Now, I imagine it hasn't occurred to him that maybe part of the reason why he's more familiar with Isaac Newton has something to do with the language that he spoke. And I am steeped. I don't know. Maybe Ben Shapiro was steeped and raised in a context in which history was presented to him, and science and all forms of human achievement were presented to him from a, let's say, Asian-centric, Far East Asian-centric worldview. And he's overcome that to realize that folks like Isaac Newton are the most important folks that we have. But also, what is India? Like, when we're talking about, presumably Isaac Newton's around in the 1600s, 17th century, right? Maybe a little bit early. What is India at that point? Is like the Far East? Is he what he's talking about? Broadly speaking,
the state of India didn't exist during the time frame that they invented.
What differentiates India
stuff.
from Pakistan in his mind?
Yeah.
What do you think that is?
Because usually when I hear people talk about different, contributions to science, that's the part where you talk about, algebra and optics and Islam. But I guess
no, maybe not so much. Let's go.
People were doing in other civilizations. That doesn't mean that every other person in every other civilization was incapable of doing this. Obviously, there were strides in science and mathematics, particularly in the Indian world, as in like India, in the Indian world in the first millennia. But the great expanse of science was deeply wedded to, historically speaking, the judeo-christian belief that in order to investigate God, you had to investigate God's universe. And that was tied to a Greek natural law, evidentiary-based position that the way to discover natural rules was to look at the evidence. I mean, that's an Aristotelian idea. So, as I say, this is not to discount any of the discoveries of other civilizations. The question is why the West did it best. And the answer is that the West did it best not just because they were making technological advances. Again, technological advances exist throughout history. The question is, why is it that the West came up with this idea of science, this generalized idea of science, which was then used to create tremendous technological change far beyond what you get if you were just in a field and you needed to figure out how to make a plow work better, for example.
Is there any more to, okay. All right. First of all, I'm quite sure that the idea of science did not exist but for maybe 100 or 200 years ago. Like these people aren't going like, this is science for science sake. No, they were exploring things about their world and did not codify it in some form, narrow form of like, of academia. Now, in addition to sort of just like instinctively saying like, wait a second, no, that's not, I'm sorry. Judeo-Christians were not the only ones to just to develop and think about the world and the universe and the physics of things and the sort of the non-tangible things, right? It wasn't just like, oh, the Jews and the Christians, they just left behind all that stuff about how do you make the plow better? I'm too busy thinking about the stars. They weren't the only ones. And Juan Cole did a real devastating takedown of Ben Shapiro. He writes, everything Shapiro says is wrong. This is the professor of Middle Eastern Studies from University of Michigan, who incidentally was offered, I believe, tenure track at Yale until hardcore right-wing Zionists prevented him from taking that position. Juan Cole goes on to say, Judeo-Christian as a term was invented by 19th century missionaries intent on converting Jews and only came into common parlance in the mid-20th century, in part in reaction to the rise of fascism and communism. Many Jews have found the phrase objectionable. In any case, nothing called Judeo-Christian underpinned Western science. But beyond that, he said, even the Aristotelians were relatively cerebral and more based on observation than experiment. Observation would be more like, hey, is this going to work better for the plow? Moreover, Western Europe lost contact with Greek learning from roughly 410 until the 1200s. During those centuries, Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, among others, were cultivated in, are you ready for this? The Muslim world. Yes.
No.
With the Abbasid rulers, 750 to 1258, commissioning translations and funding further study.
That's the Abbasid Caliphate, actually.
Whoa. Moreover, the Muslims made substantial advances of their own work within the Greek paradigm. As for Christianity, and this, I think most people, if they spent like 5 minutes, would think about this, it was often inhospitable to science.
What?
And even to general literacy in the print revolution. Astronomer Tycho Brahe was exiled from Denmark on charges of heresy. The Inquisition summoned Galileo. You'll recall. Didn't he end up dying in like a jail or something like that?
Something like that.
1616 to warn him against teaching that the earth goes around the sun. That seems to be very non-Christian of them. But then again, it turns out to be super Christian of them.
There's also Giordano Bruno, who I think was maybe put on a stake. I'm not sure.
As for Jews, Jewish authorities in Amsterdam somehow managed to excommunicate and completely shun Spinoza, placing him under a ban. Why? Because he said that God is the God of nature.
Their minds were blown by too many high-level ideas.
In other words, Ben Shapiro is just shoveling out BS as history and expecting everyone to slurp it up and lick their lips. Although he built on Greek discoveries and used Sanskrit number system, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, 780 to 850 CE of Baghdad, is generally now credited with inventing algebra, which I suppose you could argue, this is my commentary, was just to figure out how many oxen it would take.
How do you get the plow to plow better?
Yeah. Well, wait a second. I've got this big field here, and how many ox would take? What is the X in this? He also invented the algorithm, which is an Arabic word. Well, but again, that was a very practical application. I'll remind you, if you're plowing the fields.
Ben Shapiro's got some problems with algorithms lately.
Yes. Hassan ibn al-Haytham, known as Al-Zen alive in the 11th century, is among the first scientists explicitly to have laid out the scientific method of hypothesis and experimentation that Shapiro praises. More than likely, he found it from a Jew or a Christian and just adopted it by his own. He also first explained optics as light bouncing off an object and hitting the eye, which is also very important as you're plowing the fields.
When you're plowing a field.
You're plowing the fields.
You need to know how light goes through translucent bodies when you're plowing a field.
There'll be times where you are plowing the field and someone will come over and say, how do you know that oxen is there? And you must say that it's because the light bounces off the oxen and goes through my eye, and I call that optics, but the most important part I'm talking about is the plow.
Just technology.
Just technology. The sophisticated astronomical observatory in El-Khan, Iran during the 1200s at the Mariga made breakthroughs in understanding planetary motion, which of course is extremely important when you are plowing the fields. If you are not aware that the moon will rise and the sun will rise, then you cannot plow the fields because it'll be too dark when you go out to do it. Honey, I'm heading out to the fields. I have no way of predicting whether it'll be sunlight out or moonlight. And then, of course, he goes on to say, and this is to say nothing of thousands of years of sophisticated Chinese science. China in the era of the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279, essentially saw the invention of modernity, with high levels of urbanization, industry, wood block printing, progress in engineering, science, and mathematics, along with paper money, gunpowder weapons, and the invention of the compass. Yeah. Those are all technological.
China, India, whatever.
Yeah.
It's so crazy.
Non-Muslim Chinese. I mean, not that has anything to do with my assessment. It's just, how is it that, I got to say, how desperate are these guys for their business model that they're all having to go and all roads lead back to the judeo-christian values that are preeminent. I want to find a nice way to say this.
Well, he's trying to do this weird Orientalism on the entire Arab world and say, oh, you only invented science because of material factors, when the West, which, by the way, modern concepts of the West are fairly recent and have not always existed. It's kind of a made-up fantasy thing. The West did it for philosophical, for ideological reasons. It's this utter resistance to historical materialism or material explanations for why people do things. There couldn't possibly be a material explanation for why people in the quote unquote West believed the things that they believed. He wants things to be driven completely by ideology and by stories, by myths, which is pretty anti-scientific if you ask me.
It's also biology. Biology is also what makes these people just question things in a more sophisticated manner.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's ironic in that, the main reason that Western, quote-unquote, feudalisms would support something like astronomy is mainly for things like going across seas so you can take over land from other nations and things like that.
There's always a material basis for the things that happen in history.
Right.
Well, that's different. Let me make an analogy. I'm saying that, let's just say for the sake of ease, non-white people who don't believe in Christianity or Judaism, they look at the field and they're just interested in plowing the field. And I think it is to the credit of the white people who are we need more fields. So how are we going to get that? And we will it's that first jump
Well,
we need more.
the argument against practical science too is interesting, coming from the right, where normally they say like, why don't you do something that can lead to like making money on the market or something
Right, of
like
course.
that.
Well, he took a break from that.
Like the Muslim should be like,
To
why
just-
don't you guys get a real job? Stop.
Right, exactly.